Welcome to Sleepless, Philosophers. Here's a thought that quietly unsettles the bones beneath belief. What if truth is not about accuracy, but about repetition? What if most convictions about the world, about other people, about the self, are illusions dressed up as certainties, whispered to us so many times that we forgot to question them? Tonight we drift softly into the eerie stillness of the mind's paradoxes, those quiet hallways where reality flickers like candlelight against the stone walls of an ancient cave. We'll explore the strange, the circular, the almost true, paradoxes, thought experiments, and the psychological traps that shape human thought without anyone noticing. If that sounds like your kind of insomnia, press like, tap, subscribe, and tell us, where are you listening from and what time is glowing on your clock? I wonder how many people are lying awake at this very moment, questioning whether anything is as it seems. We begin with something ancient, a shadow. Plato's allegory of the cave. Imagine this, a dark cavern. Prisoners, chained since birth, can only stare forward at a wall. Behind them a fire. Between the fire and the prisoners, people walk past with objects. The prisoners cannot see the people. They can only see the shadows, flickering outlines cast on the stone. And to them, the shadows are reality. That is their world. A silhouette of a horse is a horse. The echo of a voice is the voice. One prisoner is freed, dragged out into the painful sunlight. He recoils, resists. The truth is too bright, too unfamiliar, but slowly his eyes adjust. He sees the real horse, the real sky, the real fire, and he realizes his entire life has been a hallucination, an illusion cast by light and belief. When he returns to the cave to tell the others, they mock him. They don't want the truth. They want the comfort of the familiar. It's not just a metaphor, it's a warning. Now ask, what are the shadows on our own walls? Stories, news, memories. Every day we accept flickering shapes as truth. But how many of those truths were never questioned, only repeated? This is where the illusory truth effect comes in. A real phenomenon, studied since 1977. Psychologists Lynn Hasher and David Goldstein ran an experiment. They gave people true and false statements mixed together. When the false ones were repeated enough times, people began to believe them. Not because they made sense, not because they matched evidence, but because the brain favors what it has heard before. The more familiar a lie becomes, the more convincing it feels. Not accurate, just familiar. That's how we're wired. It's why propaganda works, why advertising slogans live rent-free in the mind. It's why people still say we only use 10% of our brains, or that lightning never strikes twice. The brain doesn't care if it's false, it cares if it feels safe. Truth becomes a rhythm. A song we've heard so often we forget the words are nonsense. Now pair that with memory. Human memory is not a camera, it's a storyteller. Every time a memory is recalled, it changes. Psychologists have shown this again and again. Details shift, gaps are filled, emotions bleed into the facts. Memory is not the past, it is the story of the past, retold to protect the ego, or fit the mood, or justify a choice. Think about that. Think about how many beliefs are built on stories we remember, not because they are true, but because they are easy to remember. Repetition becomes familiarity. Familiarity becomes truth. And then comes the mirror. Not the one on the wall, the psychological mirror. The mirror effect. Another quiet trick. People trust those who reflect them. If someone subtly mirrors your body language, your speech patterns, your tone, you feel they understand you. You don't know why, but you relax. You trust. Your guard lowers. This is how manipulators work. They mirror, they repeat, they reflect, they whisper what you already believe, they echo what you already feel, and you think, they get me. But what if they're just a shadow on the wall? A reflection of your own habits, your own fears, your own forgotten narratives? It gets darker. Consider solipsism, the eerie philosophical idea that that nothing exists but your own mind, that everything else, this voice, the stars, the memories of yesterday, might be illusions. You have never experienced the world directly, only your interpretation of it, only neural signals filtered through a brain that favors comfort over clarity. If the senses can lie, if memory can distort, if repetition can override truth, what can we trust? Maybe nothing. And yet, here's the twist, that doesn't have to be terrifying. It can be liberating. Because if the world is built on illusions, on shadows and echoes and loops, then perhaps freedom lies in noticing them, questioning them, peeling them back gently, not to find a final truth, but to find clarity in awareness. Viktor Frankl, who survived the Holocaust and lost everything, said that man's last freedom is the ability to choose one's attitude. He saw the worst of human deception, and yet he believed that meaning was something we create, not discover, that we are not just prisoners of the cave, we are also the ones who can walk out, and perhaps walk back in with open eyes. The philosopher Nietzsche warned us about this too. He said, "Convictions are more dangerous enemies of truth than lies, not because they are false, but because they are repeated so often that we forget to doubt them. We tie our identities to them, and then we defend them, not because they are right, but because they are ours." Belief becomes territory, and the battle is never over facts, it's over familiarity. So tonight, let every idea be a candle. Let every paradox be a soft knock on the wall of the cave. What if none of this is real? What if all of this is real, but only as a dream is real, vivid while it lasts? And if the mind is dreaming, would it know the difference? These are not questions to answer, only to feel quietly, like wind moving through trees in the dark. Let them swirl and soften and settle. Let the rhythm of doubt lead to a deeper peace. The truth may not be clear, but the awareness of illusion is a kind of light, and that may be enough. If everything can be doubted and truth itself can be faked by repetition, then what does it mean to know anything at all? This is where the next thought waits, quiet, unsettling, and oddly familiar. The ship of Theseus. It begins simply enough. A ship owned by the mythical Greek hero Theseus is preserved for generations. As time passes, each wooden plank begins to rot. One by one, the planks are replaced. Eventually, every single piece of wood is new. Not a single original board remains. Now the question, is it still the same ship? Most would say yes. The changes were gradual. The form is unchanged. It sailed the same waters. It bore the same name. But now imagine this. All the old rotting planks had been stored in a warehouse. And one day, a craftsman rebuilds a second ship, made entirely of the original materials. Now, which is the real ship of Theseus? The one made of new parts or the one made of old ones? Identity fractures. The idea of self trembles. Because this story is not really about boats, it's about people, about continuity, about the illusion of permanence. Human beings replace most of their cells every few years. The body changes, the memories change, the personality shifts. Yet the feeling of being me remains oddly consistent. Why? What anchors identity if everything within us is always changing? This isn't abstract, it's quietly horrifying. Think of a childhood photo. The child in that image has a different face, different thoughts, different fears. That version of you is gone, replaced plank by plank. Yet you claim the same name, the same past, but how many decisions in your life were made by someone else? You, but not quite you. A different version, a different plank. So who's really steering the ship now? Philosophy turns in on itself here. John Locke, centuries ago, tried to define personal identity as continuity of consciousness. If the same memories flow forward, then identity is preserved. But what happens when memory falters? When trauma rewrites the past? When emotion distorts events into fictions? The ship becomes a paradox. A body that is always new. A mind that is always edited. And still, we claim to be the same person. We introduce ourselves. We say I, but what does I really mean? The psychologist Dan McAdams believed identity is a story we tell ourselves. Not a truth, a narrative, a constructed myth, carefully written and constantly revised. A story that justifies our feelings, that explains our choices, that smooths over contradictions. And the darker the contradiction, the more elegant the story must become. People who lie often believe their own lies, not out of evil, but out of the need for coherence. The ship cannot be split in half, so the mind stitches a sail from old cloth and moves forward as if nothing happened. Now think of modern dilemmas. A person transitions genders, a criminal reforms, a loved one suffers memory loss. Are they still the same person? At what point does change fracture the identity? Is a clone of a person, genetically identical, behaviourally similar, still them? Science fiction grapples with this endlessly. If consciousness could be uploaded to a machine, would it still be you? If a robot copies every thought, every memory, every preference, does it have your soul? And if your physical body dies but the replica lives on, did you survive? Or did you die, replaced by a convincing impersonator? This is not just theoretical. Artificial intelligence now mimics human thought. Machines finish our sentences, suggest our next move. Some chatbots imitate loved ones who have passed. And when the language is close enough, when the voice is right, the mannerisms precise, we begin to forget that it is not real. We project identity onto repetition. Again, repetition. The same mechanism that makes lies feel true also makes simulations feel alive. The pattern becomes the person, and somewhere in that realization is a shiver. If we can be fooled by imitation, then maybe the self is not a sacred flame. Maybe it's a pattern, a loop, a collection of repeated behaviors wrapped in a story. Just like the ship of Theseus. If a ship sails the same route, carries the same flag, behaves like the ship, it is the ship, until it isn't. The philosopher Derek Parfit pushed this further. He suggested that personal identity might not even matter. What matters is psychological continuity, memories, intentions, personality traits. And if those continue in a copy, then perhaps the copy is as real as the original. But this fractures our sense of morality. If a person can split into two copies, both with equal claim to the past, which one is owed the future? If one suffers and the other thrives, who deserves justice? This thought unravels the threads of ethics. We punish criminals because we believe they are the same person who committed the crime. But what if they've changed completely? Is the person who repents still responsible for the sins of someone they no longer are? What if through age or illness or injury, their brain rewires completely? At what point does the ship become another vessel entirely? In ancient Japan, swords were passed down for generations. Each one repaired, reforged, sometimes rebladed, but always called by the same name. Not because the metal was the same, but because the story was the same. Because honor flowed through it like memory through neurons. A ship, a sword, a person, all rebuilt piece by piece over time, and still we say, this is mine, this is me. But what if identity is just a ghost that follows the ship? Not real, not false, just persistent. We believe in it because we must, because to question it too deeply is to risk drifting, to lose our compass, to float in the vast ocean of change without anchor or name. So we hold on. We point to the rebuilt ship and say, that's the one, and maybe that's enough. Not because it's true, but because it keeps us sailing, through memory, through change, through the soft illusion of self, always just familiar enough to feel real. What if morality is nothing more than a question of perspective? What if every rule, every judgment, every law etched into the heart of a civilization is built on a foundation that shifts like sand under moonlight? Enter the trolley problem, a quiet nightmare disguised as a thought experiment. A runaway trolley barrels down a track. 5 people are tied ahead. helpless. Do nothing, and they will die. But there's a lever nearby. Pull it, and the trolley diverts to another track, where only one person is tied. One action, one choice. Let 5 die or kill one. Utilitarian logic whispers clearly, sacrifice the few to save the many. But the moment a hand reaches for the lever, something deep inside resists, because now the blood is on that hand. The death isn't accidental, it is authored, and suddenly the lines blur. This is not about numbers, this is about guilt, about ownership of harm. Some argue for the math, greater good, minimal loss. Others, like the deontologists, say that killing is killing regardless of outcome. That moral action is about principle, not consequence. But then the thought shifts. What if instead of pulling a lever, the only way to stop the trolley is to push a large man off a bridge to block the track? Same result. 1 dies, 5 are saved, but something in the gut twists tighter. Suddenly more people refuse. Why? The outcome is identical. Yet touching the man, physically causing death, feels worse than pulling a lever. Distance changes morality. Proximity intensifies responsibility. Now the mind stutters. Emotion begins to override logic. That's where psychology meets philosophy. We are not rational creatures. We are creatures of thresholds, of symbols, of proximity. The brain contains mirror neurons, designed to simulate what we see. When we witness pain, we feel echoes of it. But the farther away the victim, the quieter the echo. Numbers do not feel. Faces do. That's why people cry over a single child but feel nothing for 1,000 in a distant headline. It's not apathy. It's biology. It's the flaw in the system. Psychologist Daniel Kahneman described this as System 1, thinking. Fast, emotional, intuitive. It governs most human behavior. Morality, it turns out, is not a calculation. It's a story. And in stories, context matters. Now imagine a twist. The one person on the second track is a child, or a doctor, or someone you love. The 5 are strangers. Does the choice change? Most say yes, so morality shifts again. It is not absolute. It is personal. It bends under emotion. Now add another layer. What if the 5 people tied to the track had committed terrible crimes? What if the one was innocent? The trolley keeps moving, and the mind keeps folding. Friedrich Nietzsche once wrote that there are no moral phenomena, only moral interpretations. He meant that morality does not exist outside of us. We invent it, project it, shape it to fit our fears and our dreams. We declare something evil, not because it is, but because we must call it something. To tame it, to understand it, but the wildness remains. In war, soldiers must kill to protect. They are given medals. In civilian life, that same act is a crime. The context changes the meaning. Morality mutates. The ancient Greeks knew this. In tragedies, heroes were often punished, not for evil, but for hubris, believing they knew what was right. Morality was not a code, but a chaos. Something sacred and dangerous. Something that punished certainty. Modern thinkers have tried to systematize ethics. Kant said we must act only according to that maxim, which we would will to become a universal law. But even that breaks under pressure. What if telling a lie saves a life? What if stealing bread feeds a starving child? The rule collapses. Utilitarians like Jeremy Bentham argue for outcome over intent. The best act is the one that creates the most happiness. But what about the happiness of the cruel? What about false joy? The math becomes murky. And still, the trolley rolls on. The world today is full of trolleys. Self-driving cars programmed with ethical algorithms. Who should they protect in a crash? The driver? The pedestrian? The child or the elderly? Someone must decide. And every decision writes a quiet law. In medicine, doctors face triage. Who gets the ventilator? Who gets the transplant? Who lives? Who waits? Who dies? These are trolley problems wrapped in white coats and clipboards. In war, drones are guided by operators thousands of miles away. A button pressed, a house destroyed. The distance numbs the conscience, but the death is still real. The modern world hides the lever, but it is still in someone's hand. And perhaps that's the true horror. That morality isn't clear, that right and wrong are not opposites, but tangled twins. Each choice creates a scar, each value a wound. Philosopher Philippa Foot, who popularized the trolley problem, didn't seek easy answers. She wanted to show how fragile moral reasoning is, how intuition and logic often point in opposite directions. She wanted to make us uncomfortable, because comfort is the enemy of ethics. When we stop questioning, we start repeating. And as we've seen, repetition is not truth. Repetition is hypnosis. The mind drifts, the body acts, the lever moves, and afterward the questions come. Was it right? Was it necessary? Was it mine to decide? These questions haunt. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the only moral compass worth trusting is not the one that tells us what to do, but the one that never stops asking. So as the candle flickers low and the air thickens with thought, remember the trolley. It never stops. It keeps coming, in choices, in relationships, in silence. There is always a lever and a moment to decide. Not just what action to take, but what kind of person to become. Imagine this. Every choice ever made, every word ever spoken, every twitch of a muscle was never truly chosen. That behind every movement, every thought, every apparent decision, there was a cause, a domino, and before that, another. Stretching back not just seconds or minutes, but years, centuries, eons, that the entire universe is one unbroken chain of cause and effect, and everything we do is simply the next link in that chain. This is the idea of determinism, and it cuts through the illusion of freedom like a knife through fog. If every action is determined by previous events, by biology, environment, physics, then where is free will? What does it mean to choose if the choice was already built into the system long before we arrived? The philosopher Baruch Spinoza believed that free will was a comforting illusion, a trick of perspective. He said that just as a rock flying through the air might believe it is choosing its path if it were conscious, so do humans believe they choose, when in fact they are simply in motion, pushed by forces they do not understand. Modern neuroscience echoes this chilling idea. In experiments, researchers like Benjamin Libet found that the brain shows activity milliseconds before a person becomes consciously aware of their decision. The body decides, the mind rationalizes, and yet we feel free. We feel like agents, like authors of our lives. This is the contradiction. The experience of freedom is real, but the mechanism may not be. Now consider the implications. If all our choices are pre-written by prior causes, then morality changes. Responsibility changes. Can a person be blamed for something they were always going to do? If a murderer's brain is wired for violence, through genetics, trauma, upbringing, then is the murder a choice or an outcome? Some argue that determinism removes justice. Others say it adds compassion. Because if we are not the architects of our flaws, then we are not monsters, but victims of sequence. But determinism is not fatalism. That's a common confusion. Fatalism says events will happen no matter what we do. Determinism says events happen because of what we do, and what we do is shaped by everything that came before. The river does not stand still. It flows, but its course is carved by history. Now enter the idea of compatibilism, the belief that free will and determinism can coexist, that even if our choices are influenced by prior causes, we still have meaningful agency. Because we are not passive objects, we are complex systems, influenced, yes, but not puppets. Think of a chess player. The rules are fixed, the board is known, but within those limits, a player can still strategize, improvise, choose. Compatibilists argue that free will does not mean total freedom. It means freedom within context, within constraint. And perhaps that is enough, but others disagree. The hard determinists say that even our thoughts of freedom are programmed. That consciousness itself is just an emergent property, a side effect of a brain obeying physical laws. That the self is not a pilot, but a passenger. Watching the scenery go by and imagining it has control of the wheel, this brings us to a darker place. If free will is an illusion, then identity dissolves. We are not who we choose to be. We are who we were caused to be. And all our beliefs, our values, our loves and fears are echoes of causes we did not create. Think of that for a moment. Let it settle in. If the person listening now is shaped entirely by biology and experience, then even the act of reflecting on this idea is just another domino falling. Yet something in us resists, something rebels. The rebellion itself, perhaps, is part of the program. But still we ask, what about change? What about those who overcome addiction or transform their lives? Isn't that proof of choice? Not necessarily. Determinists would say that the change was just the next step in a longer causal chain, a new input, a new result, but still determined. Viktor Frankl, imprisoned in a concentration camp, wrote that everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances. But was that freedom, or was it the outcome of character, of values shaped by upbringing, of a mind built to resist despair? Does it matter? Maybe not. Maybe the illusion is necessary. Maybe life without the belief in choice is unbearable. If we truly believed we were robots, responding, reacting, never initiating, would love still matter? Would art? Would kindness? Or would we fall into apathy, into nihilism? Perhaps the belief in freedom is the freedom. The philosopher William James, father of American psychology, said that we should believe in free will not because we can prove it, but because it makes life livable. That belief itself is a choice that shapes the future. But is that circular logic? Believing in choice because it's useful, not because it's true? Maybe, but many truths are like that. Evolution didn't build us for truth, it built us for survival. And maybe the illusion of free will is one of evolution's most beautiful lies. Because without it, everything changes. Without it, there is no blame, no pride, no shame, no hope, only sequence. So we live in the in-between, the paradox, where the past pushes us forward, but the present still feels like ours. Where every choice may be determined, but still feels real. Where freedom may be an illusion, but it's an illusion that gives us life. And perhaps, in the silence of the mind, in the softness of night, that's enough. There is a kind of silence that doesn't feel peaceful, but hollow. A silence that arrives when all the noise of meaning begins to fade. When the rituals, the roles, the reasons start to unravel in the mind like a thread pulled too far. This is the silence of existential angst, a low, constant hum that lives just beneath the surface of modern life. It's not fear exactly. It's not sadness either. It's a quiet, unspoken dread that asks, what's the point? Why am I here? What am I supposed to do with this strange finite life? It is the dizziness of freedom, as Søren Kierkegaard called it. The vertigo that hits when a person realizes that nothing is truly holding them. No fate, no divine plan, no cosmic purpose. They are free, and because they're free, they are responsible. And because they are responsible, they are afraid. Kierkegaard believed that most people escape this fear by leaping into belief. Religion, ideology, community, anything to silence the question. But the question never dies. It waits. Jean-Paul Sartre picked up the thread and declared that existence precedes essence, that there is no blueprint for a human life. That man is not born with meaning, but must invent it. And this invention is a burden. Because how can a person invent meaning while surrounded by chaos, contradiction, and an uncaring universe? Sartre called it nausea. Camus called it the absurd. The feeling that life demands meaning, but the world offers none. We crave purpose, but the stars do not answer. The mountains do not whisper our names. The silence remains. And yet we keep asking. We build careers. We chase pleasure. We fall in love. We have children. We pursue goals. But underneath all of it is the same hum. The knowledge that none of it is guaranteed to matter. That even the most beautiful life ends. That even the brightest flame goes out. And still the world moves on. This is existential angst. Not a mood, not a phase, but a fundamental condition of being human. Some call it depression, but it is not always clinical. It is not always a sickness. Sometimes it is clarity. A glimpse behind the curtain. A moment of naked truth. And in that moment, many people do not know what to do. Some numb it with work. Some drown it in distraction. Others turn it into rebellion. Camus imagined Sisyphus, condemned to roll a boulder up a hill for eternity. A task without end. A life without reward. And yet, he said, we must imagine Sisyphus happy. Because even in the face of absurdity, there is defiance. There is choice. There is the decision to live anyway, to create beauty in spite of the void, to love in spite of death, to laugh in the face of cosmic indifference. But this is not easy. It is not poetic. It is not soft. It is brutal. It is the raw choice to be human when it would be easier not to be. Viktor Frankl, who survived Auschwitz, wrote that those who found meaning in their suffering were more likely to survive. Not because meaning was real, but because the mind needs it, because the body follows the story the mind tells. He said that between stimulus and response there is a space, and in that space lies our freedom and our growth. And perhaps that space is where existential angst lives. In the gap, in the moment when we realize we are not puppets, but also not gods, that we are both powerless and powerful, that we must choose without knowing, act without guarantees, and still carry on. But why? Why continue when the meaning is invented, the pain is real, and the ending is certain? Because the alternative is worse. Because surrender is emptier than struggle. Because even in the face of nothingness, a single act of kindness matters. A moment of connection matters. A shared glance, a breath in cold air, the scent of rain. These things do not solve the problem, but they make the weight bearable. Nietzsche said that those who have a why can bear almost any how. But what if there is no why? Then we must become the why. We must be the reason, the meaning makers, the myth tellers, the artists of the absurd. The mind rebels against this, of course. It wants certainty. It wants instruction. It wants a path. But no path appears. So we walk anyway. We walk in circles, we stumble, we get up. And in time the angst becomes less terrifying. It becomes a companion, a reminder that this life is not a rehearsal, that no one is coming to save us, that every moment is a choice, and that the choice is ours. Not in a grand, heroic sense, but in a quiet, daily way, in the way we treat others, in the way we respond to disappointment, in the way we get out of bed on the days when nothing feels worth it. This is existential courage. Not the absence of fear, but action in its presence. And maybe in the end, that is meaning enough. Not something given, but something made. Not something found, but something forged. In fire, in doubt, in the night. And when the morning comes and the shadows lift just a little, we might find that the silence is not as empty as we thought. That in facing the void, we have filled it, with effort, with presence, with ourselves. Imagine a man walks into a room and sees two doors. One door leads to certain pain. The other leads to a random outcome. Maybe pleasure. Maybe something worse. He hesitates, torn not by logic but by fear. This is the prisoner's dilemma of the mind. The paradox of decision. The illusion of control. Human beings crave agency. The sense that their choices shape the world. But what if most choices aren't real choices at all? What if they're performances, rituals, responses to hidden variables we barely understand? Behavioral economics has long shown that people are far less rational than they believe. Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky map the strange ways we betray logic. We overvalue certainty. We fear loss more than we value gain. We make decisions not to win, but to avoid regret. And in doing so, we reveal the glitch in the system. One of the most famous mental traps is the framing effect. Present the same outcome two ways, once as a gain, once as a loss, and people will react differently. Say a medicine has a 90% survival rate, and people nod with hope. Say it has a 10% mortality rate, and fear spreads. Same data, different framing. The mind does not respond to truth. It responds to tone. This is how manipulation works, not through lies but through emphasis, through omission, through rhythm, and it's everywhere. Politicians use it, marketers breathe it, even our own memories use it. The mind frames its past to protect the ego, to make sense of chaos, and once the frame is set, everything else bends to fit. This is how people stay in abusive relationships, how nations justify war, how cults recruit ordinary people. Not by changing facts, but by changing lenses. And when the frame controls perception, even freedom begins to vanish. Now consider learned helplessness. In the 1960s, Martin Seligman conducted a disturbing experiment. Dogs were placed in a box where one side delivered electric shocks. Initially, the dogs tried to escape, but when escape proved impossible, they stopped trying. Later, even when the door was opened, they remained in place, paralyzed, conditioned to believe that nothing they did mattered. The shocking part is this: humans behave the same way. In toxic jobs, in failing systems, in personal despair. When effort is punished and outcomes feel random, people stop trying. They tell themselves stories. I'm just unlucky. I'm not smart enough. It's always been this way. These beliefs become walls, not real ones, but they might as well be. And yet, just as learned helplessness is real, so is its opposite, learned hopefulness. A person exposed to small wins, to control over small outcomes, begins to rebuild agency. The frame shifts, the story changes, and that tiny shift can be enough to spark transformation. But this is not easy, because the mind resists change. It clings to familiar pain over unfamiliar peace. It chooses known suffering over uncertain freedom. This is the comfort of cages, the safety of repetition, even if that repetition kills. Psychologists call this status quo bias, the tendency to prefer things as they are, even when as they are is broken. Because change requires risk, and risk triggers fear. So people freeze, they rationalize. They say, it's not so bad. They say, others have it worse. They say, maybe someday. But someday doesn't come. Not because it can't, but because fear dressed as logic said no. This is why people stay poor, even when opportunity knocks. Why some never leave towns that suffocate them. Why talents go undeveloped. Why love withers in silence. Because the decision wasn't really a decision. It was a reflex, a protection, an echo of past punishments. And unless that echo is questioned, it becomes prophecy. Now think of reactance, the rebellious instinct that flares up when freedom is threatened. Tell a child they can't have a toy, and suddenly that toy becomes sacred. Tell an adult what to believe, and their beliefs harden in defiance. Reactance is why persuasion often backfires. It's why people double down on conspiracy theories. Why correction feels like attack. The brain values autonomy over accuracy. It wants to decide, even if the decision is wrong. And that too can be used. Manipulators don't argue, they guide. They let people arrive at false conclusions on their own, because a belief discovered is stronger than one imposed, even if it's a lie, especially if it's a lie. These tactics are old. Religious leaders used them. Cults perfected them. Now algorithms do the same, feeding users a curated stream of validation, outrage, and confirmation bias, nudging behavior with invisible hands. And the users believe they're free. They say, I chose this. But the choice was primed, the path was laid, and the illusion is complete. So where is the exit? Is there one? Can we escape manipulation if even awareness of it can be manipulated? Maybe the answer isn't escape. Maybe it's resistance, quiet resistance, slow noticing, watching the thoughts that arise, asking where they came from, who benefits, what's missing. This is what philosopher Michel Foucault called critical consciousness, the ability to see the structures beneath the surface. Not just what is said, but what is silenced. Not just what is shown, but what is framed. It's not about becoming paranoid. It's about becoming aware. There's power in that, because when the frame is seen, it can be changed. When the script is exposed, it can be rewritten, but only with effort, only with discomfort, only by accepting that some of what we believe may be false, not because we're foolish, but because we were trained. And training is powerful, but not permanent. And in that gap between what we've been told and what we quietly suspect is the space for freedom. Maybe not full freedom, but more than before. Enough to matter, enough to try, and that, perhaps, is all we need. There is a strange power in the eyes of the crowd, an ancient tension that pulses beneath cities, schools, corporations, dinner tables, the quiet tyranny of the many. Most people think they think for themselves, but the truth is softer, sadder, more disturbing. We are social animals, yes, but more than that, we are mirrors. Psychological studies show it again and again. Humans conform, even when they know the answer is wrong, even when it feels like betrayal. In 1951, Solomon Asch ran one of the most famous experiments in behavioral psychology. He showed participants a line, then asked them to choose which of 3 comparison lines matched it in length. The answer was obvious, but when the room was filled with Confederates, people secretly working with the experimenter, who all gave the wrong answer, most participants began to agree with the crowd, even when their eyes told them otherwise, even when their gut twisted in doubt. Why? Because the fear of standing alone is often stronger than the desire to be right. Because to be socially wrong is more painful than to be privately right. And this is not weakness, it's wiring. Conformity is not a flaw of the human mind, it is its survival mechanism. In tribes, in history, in war, those who stood apart were often cast out, and to be cast out was death. So we learned over generations to bend, to nod, to echo, to feel what the group feels, even if it goes against reason. But this tendency doesn't disappear in modern life. It adapts. It wears suits and uniforms and hashtags. It enters politics, religion, corporate meetings. It whispers, "Don't question that. Don't say that. Don't be the only one who sees the emperor has no clothes." The result is what psychologists call groupthink, when harmony becomes more important than truth, when critical thinking dissolves under pressure, when entire rooms of intelligent people make disastrous decisions because no one wants to be the first to speak. The Challenger disaster, the Bay of Pigs invasion, financial crashes, these were not caused by stupidity. They were caused by silence, by pressure, by the soft gravity of agreement. And it's not just high-stakes rooms. It happens in families, in classrooms, online, in groups. The average IQ drops. Not because people become dumber, but because they censor themselves. They perform, they watch, they wonder who's watching them, and then they adjust. Even their facial expressions change. Mirror neurons fire. Social calibration kicks in. It's unconscious, it's automatic, it's how humans survive. But there's a cost, a deep, invisible cost, the death of authenticity, the loss of inner truth. How many people go through life saying things they don't believe, wearing masks they forgot were masks, smiling on the outside while something inside dims? This is the slow erosion of self, not through trauma, but through mimicry, through the quiet need to belong. But even this has a paradox, because the opposite of conformity, total rebellion, can become a trap too. If someone builds their identity entirely on opposition, they are still reacting to the crowd. still shaped by it. The rebel is as bound to the group as the follower, just facing the other way. True independence is harder. It is quieter. It asks not, what do they think, but what do I actually think? And that question, when asked honestly, can be terrifying, because it might lead to answers that isolate, to beliefs that others hate, to paths that require walking alone. And loneliness is no small price. We are wired to fear it. The brain processes social rejection like physical pain. Studies show that exclusion activates the same neural regions as a broken bone. So when someone chooses truth over comfort, integrity over approval, they are choosing pain. At least at first. But over time, something else happens. The pain sharpens the self. The silence becomes signal. The solitude becomes a forge. And the person who learns to stand alone becomes stronger than the crowd. Not in defiance, not in pride, but in clarity. Because when the noise fades, what remains is real. Philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer wrote that truth passes through 3 stages. First, it is ridiculed. Second, it is violently opposed. Third, it is accepted as self-evident. But most people never make it past stage 1. They crumble under ridicule. They avoid opposition. They wait for the world to agree before they believe. And in doing so, they miss the truth entirely. They trade depth for safety. But safety is not safe. It erodes, it suffocates, it numbs, and the soul, if ignored long enough, begins to rust. So how do we escape the crowd? Not by isolating, not by fighting, but by remembering. Remembering what it felt like to know something before anyone else told us how to feel. Remembering the quiet conviction that lives beneath the noise. Remembering that the majority is often wrong. Slavery was once normal. Women once couldn't vote. The earth was once the center of the universe. Every great shift in history began with someone who saw differently and was willing to say so, even when it cost them everything, even when the crowd jeered. That is the price of awakening. But the reward is truth, not absolute truth, not perfect truth, but clearer truth, hard-won, self-earned. And in a world of echoes, even one honest voice can change the air. So tonight, in the softness of dark, in the calm behind the noise, ask, what do I believe truly? Where have I conformed without knowing? Where have I silenced myself to survive? And is it time to speak, even if the voice shakes, even if the room stays quiet, even if no one claps? Because maybe the soul doesn't need applause. Maybe it just needs air. There is a quiet trick the mind plays, a subtle error that slips in not through madness or ignorance, but through sheer repetition. The belief that the way things are is the way they must be. That what feels normal is also what's true. But truth and familiarity are not the same. And this confusion, though soft and invisible, reshapes the way people think, vote, love, fear. This is the illusory truth effect. The psychological phenomenon where repeated statements are more likely to be believed as true, regardless of their actual accuracy. It's not just a theory, it's a fact. In 1977, researchers Lynn Hasher, David Goldstein, and Thomas Topino demonstrated that people rated repeated false statements as more truthful over time. Not because they were convinced by logic, not because they had new evidence, but because the statements felt familiar. And familiarity feels safe. This is not stupidity. It's how the brain works. It uses processing fluency, how easily something is absorbed, as a shortcut for accuracy. If something is easy to understand, easy to recall, it must be right. The problem is that lies, when repeated often enough, become easy to recall, and so they become real, not in fact but in feeling. Propaganda machines have always understood this. Repeat the message, make it simple, say it louder, say it again, until resistance weakens, until doubt dies. Nazi propagandist Joseph Goebbels knew it. Political strategists know it. Marketing departments know it. Repeat, repeat, repeat. And the public, believing they're thinking, are really remembering, remembering what they heard most, what they saw on the headlines, what the anchor said with confidence, even if it was never true. And this effect isn't limited to media. It governs memory, relationships, identity itself. Think of the child who is told they are lazy, worthless, a failure, over and over. Even if it's not true, even if they achieve, a whisper remains, a ghost, the echo of an idea repeated until it became a belief. And beliefs are hard to kill, because they don't live in facts. They live in patterns, neural grooves, synaptic loops. This is how trauma forms, not just in pain but in repetition. And healing requires not just logic, but a new kind of repetition, a counter-narrative, a story retold again and again until it feels real, until the lie is less familiar than the truth. But that takes time and energy, and the world doesn't wait. The world floods the mind with information, most of it false, biased, or hollow. And the more it flows, the more we believe. Not because we want to, but because we are built that way. Even the smartest minds fall prey. Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman himself admitted that he often couldn't tell whether something he believed was based on fact or on familiarity. That's how deep the effect runs. So what does this mean? It means that belief is not proof of truth, that certainty is not a virtue, that the mind's default setting is not wisdom, but comfort. It means that people can be manipulated not by lies but by volume, by rhythm, by repetition. And the worst part is, once something feels true, people defend it, even violently. Cognitive dissonance kicks in. Confirmation bias filters new information, and the mind becomes a fortress, protecting a flag it doesn't remember raising. This explains political polarization, religious extremism, online echo chambers. People are not evil, they are trapped in stories they didn't write, in beliefs they didn't question, in rhythms they mistook for reality. And when truth finally knocks, it sounds unfamiliar, so they reject it, not because it's wrong, but because it's new. This is why education must be more than facts. It must be training in doubt, in slowness, in pause. The philosopher Karl Popper argued that science progresses not by proving things right, but by proving them wrong. Falsifiability is the key, but in everyday life, people seek the opposite. They seek confirmation, reassurance, fluency, and so they drift, not into evil, but into illusion, slowly, softly, like a frog in warming water. And by the time they realize, it's too familiar to leave. But not all is lost, because awareness weakens the effect. Just knowing that familiarity can distort truth gives a sliver of space, a breath, a moment to ask, is this true or just repeated? Have I examined it or just heard it too often? These questions are not comfortable. They threaten identity. They threaten group belonging. But they protect reality. And in a time where falsehood spreads faster than fire, that protection matters. Because the mind is a garden. Whatever is planted and watered and exposed to light will grow. If we repeat lies, lies grow. If we repeat kindness, kindness grows. If we repeat inquiry, inquiry grows. And perhaps that is the counterspell. To flood the mind not with noise, but with slow, deliberate truth. Not with certainty, but with curiosity. To let the unfamiliar in, to let it speak, to notice the rhythm of belief and interrupt it. That is how freedom begins. Not with rebellion, but with stillness. With the refusal to be hypnotized. With the courage to ask again, and again, and again, what is true really? There is a kind of deception more dangerous than lies, more insidious than ignorance. A deception that wears the mask of knowledge, cloaked not in chaos but in coherence. It is the illusion of explanation. The comforting but hollow sense that we understand something simply because we can name it. This is known as the illusion of explanatory depth, a psychological trap that convinces people they understand complex systems far better than they actually do. Ask someone how a zipper works, or a toilet, or a bicycle, and they might nod with confidence. But when asked to explain the mechanism in detail, most will stumble. They thought they understood. They didn't. This phenomenon was demonstrated in a 2002 study by Rosenblit and Keel. Participants rated their understanding of everyday objects and systems, then were asked to explain them. After the attempt, their self-rated understanding dropped dramatically, because naming is not knowing, labeling is not comprehension, but the mind doesn't notice the gap until it's forced to. And this illusion doesn't stop at objects. It infects politics, economics, science, morality. People adopt opinions, argue passionately, cast votes, not on the strength of deep understanding, but on the illusion that they've thought things through, and they haven't. Most beliefs are inherited, absorbed, mimicked, rarely examined. The brain is efficient. It doesn't like complexity. It likes narratives. It likes headlines. And once a belief fits into a coherent story, it feels complete. And completion feels like truth, but it's not. It's closure. And closure is the death of inquiry. This is where Dunning-Kruger enters the room. The cognitive bias where people with low ability at a task overestimate their ability. The less you know, the more confident you are. Because ignorance is invisible to itself. And that's the danger. Because in the marketplace of ideas, confidence sells, not nuance, not humility, but certainty. And certainty, when misplaced, becomes tyranny. It gives rise to ideologues, to demagogues, to leaders who speak in absolutes. People follow them not because they are right, but because they are sure. And in a confusing world, surety is seductive. But philosophy teaches the opposite. Socrates, considered the wisest man in Athens, claimed to know nothing, because wisdom begins not in answers, but in questions. And real understanding requires humility, a willingness to sit in the fog, to say, I don't know, and mean it, not as a failure, but as a starting point. Yet modern culture punishes uncertainty. It demands hot takes, instant reactions, bold claims. Algorithms amplify the loudest voices, not the wisest. And so the illusion spreads. People mistake fluency for depth. They confuse repetition with insight. They consume information not to learn, but to confirm. And in doing so, they become more entrenched, more blind. This is why debates rarely change minds, because most participants aren't seeking truth. They're defending identity. They're using words like weapons, not tools. And understanding dies in the crossfire, but it doesn't have to. There's a path back to depth. It starts with admitting the shallows, with noticing the urge to speak before we've explored, with pausing when something feels too easy to be true. Real understanding feels heavy. It carries weight. It resists simplification. If a belief fits neatly on a bumper sticker, it's probably missing something. And that missing piece is where real thinking begins. Think of systems: climate, economy, health. Each one is layered, interdependent, non-linear, and yet we treat them as simple. We blame one factor, we demand one solution, we reduce, and the reduction feels good. It gives the illusion of control. But systems don't care about our stories. They follow their own laws, and if we misread them, the consequences multiply. That's the price of shallow thinking in a complex world. It breeds fragile plans, unsound judgments, disasters that could have been avoided if someone had said, let's think deeper. But depth takes time, and silence, and discomfort. It means asking dumb questions, risking not knowing, challenging what we thought was obvious, and few people are willing to go there. Not because they're lazy, but because the world rewards the opposite: quickness, whip performance. But wisdom is slow. It digests, it doubts, it listens. And if more people embrace that kind of thinking, the world might look different. Less certain, but more honest. And honesty, when cultivated with care, becomes clarity. Not absolute clarity, not final answers, but clearer questions, better directions. This is why real philosophers rarely shout. They speak softly, Because they know the weight of words, they know the mind's hunger for illusion, and they resist it. Not because they're immune, but because they've seen behind the curtain. And what they saw was this, that most people don't know why they believe what they believe, that most certainty is borrowed, that most confidence is costume, and that the first step to wisdom is to strip that away. Gently, patiently, relentlessly, until what remains is raw, uncomfortable, real. So next time a belief feels obvious, a conclusion feels instant, a story feels too clean, pause. Ask, explain it, slowly, to yourself. See what's missing. Feel the gap, sit in it, because that gap is not weakness, it's the beginning of something honest, something rare, something the world desperately needs, depth. There is a subtle game playing at the edges of every conversation, every favour, every smile, the game of power. Not the dramatic kind seen in history books or courtroom dramas, but the quiet, invisible kind that shapes daily life without a sound. This is not about politics or wealth, it's about leverage, influence, positioning. The way people shape each other's behaviour without ever admitting it. At the core of this game is a paradox. Those who seek power directly often lose it, while those who understand its structure can wield it almost without effort. Power, as defined by sociologist Max Weber, is the ability to have one's will carried out, even against resistance. But in the real world, power rarely looks like dominance. It looks like silence, stillness, the ability to walk away, the freedom to say no. This is why detachment is one of the greatest sources of power, because those who need nothing cannot be manipulated. When a person has no desperation, they become unpredictable. And unpredictability, as any strategist knows, is strength. It creates uncertainty in the minds of others, and uncertainty breeds caution. In negotiations, relationships, group dynamics, the one who seems to care less holds more cards. This isn't cruelty, it's structure. Think of a hostage situation. Who has the power? Not the hostage who pleads, but the one who has options. And in ordinary life, those options often come from internal states, confidence, boundaries, calm. The Stoics knew this. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength, because when power is internal, it cannot be taken." This is why emotional control is perhaps the rarest and most valuable form of power. When a person does not react out of anger, fear, or need, they become difficult to provoke, impossible to predict. And in a world fueled by reaction, the unreactive hold quiet command. But most people give their power away, not in grand gestures, but in subtle habits, over-explaining, seeking approval, defending themselves unnecessarily. These actions seem harmless, even polite, but they signal insecurity. And in the language of power, insecurity invites pressure. This is how manipulation works, not through force, but through the perception of weakness. A manipulator doesn't overpower. They create a frame where the target begins to doubt themselves. They offer validation, then withdraw it. They mirror, then distort. They manufacture guilt. And if the target seeks approval, if they fear rejection, the trap closes. But the most effective defense is not resistance, it's indifference, the refusal to play. Because manipulation requires engagement. Without it, it starves. Now consider the power of mystery. In Robert Greene's The 48 Laws of Power, Law 6 states, "Court attention at all cost." But Law 4 says, "Always say less than necessary." Together, they form a strange truth. Visibility is power, but overexposure is weakness. When a person reveals everything, they lose leverage. When they hold something back, they invite curiosity. And curiosity is a form of pursuit. The pursued always holds more power than the pursuer. This is true in romance, in business, in reputation. Mystique is magnetic. Predictability is repellent. But the most dangerous power of all is the power to define reality. Those who control language control thought. Orwell knew this. In 1984, the regime didn't just punish dissent, They erased the words that could express it. Without the language for rebellion, rebellion became unthinkable. And in today's world, reality is still framed by language. The way problems are named determines how they're solved or ignored. Calling war peacekeeping, calling poverty underperformance. These are not errors. They are power moves, framing tools, and the public, unless trained to question, absorbs them as truth. This is why power and narrative are twins. Whoever tells the story wins. This happens in families, in workplaces, in politics. The one who defines the meaning of events gains control over the group's emotional response. They decide who is the villain, who is the victim, and once those roles are accepted, behaviour follows. But there is an antidote: awareness. To ask, whose story am I believing? Who benefits from this frame? What am I being nudged to feel? These questions break spells. They return power to the self, because ultimately, power is not about dominating others. It's about autonomy, self-direction, the ability to act without permission, to think without consensus, to live without apology. But this kind of power is not given, it is earned. Through solitude, through silence, through watching how the world moves and learning where to stand. Not at the centre, but just outside the line of fire, in the place where influence lives, quiet, invisible, enduring. There is something strangely comforting about labels, about categories, about the neat little boxes people use to describe themselves and others. Introvert, extrovert, empath, narcissist, victim, hero, winner, loser. But behind this need for definition lies a deeper truth, one far more complex and quietly unsettling. The human mind craves certainty, not because it understands, but because it fears. To label something is to feel control over it. To name the chaos is to soften it, to make it seem less wild. But the truth is, these identities are often illusions, stories told to shield from the fact that the self is not fixed. It is fluid. It is unstable. It changes with mood, with memory, with time. And the more tightly someone clings to a label, the more they begin to forget that labels are not mirrors. They are maps, and all maps are simplifications. Useful, yes. Accurate, rarely. This is the tragedy of identity. It simplifies what it means to be a person into something that can be printed on a form or posted on a profile, and in doing so, it blinds us to our own contradictions. Carl Jung believed that the psyche was not one unified thing, but a collection of selves, masks, shadows, fragments that speak in different voices depending on who is listening. He called these complexes, subpersonalities with their own motives, memories, and fears, and he argued that integration, not perfection, was the goal of life. To bring these parts into dialogue, to know them, not to be one thing, but to be whole. But modern culture prefers simplicity. It wants a brand, a trait, a diagnosis. It says this is who you are, full stop. But identity is not a noun, it's a verb. It is something constantly done, revised, performed. And the danger is that when someone becomes too attached to a role, they lose the ability to see outside it. The empath becomes blind to their own manipulations. The skeptic becomes a cynic. The hero becomes addicted to struggle. The victim forgets they have power. Each identity offers comfort, and each one can become a prison. This is especially dangerous in times of stress when the mind seeks safety in stories. After trauma, people often retreat into roles: survivor, orphan, martyr, saviour. Not because they are false, but because they are incomplete. And to heal, one must outgrow even the identity of healing. Viktor Frankl warned of this. In Man's Search for Meaning, he wrote that suffering ceases to be suffering the moment it finds meaning. But he also warned against becoming defined by suffering, against making pain the centerpiece of self, because identity built entirely on wounds can never imagine life without them, and so it clings to them, nurtures them, even exaggerates them. This is not conscious, it is protective. but it leads to stagnation, to repetition, to the performance of pain for validation, and the self becomes a stage. But even the roles that seem empowering can turn toxic. The strong one, who never asks for help. The smart one, who fears being wrong. The funny one, who uses jokes to hide despair. Each mask, if worn too long, fuses with the skin. And then the person forgets who they were before the applause. But beneath all masks is the same raw thing: uncertainty. And that is what most people are running from. Not failure, not rejection, but the terrifying feeling of not knowing who they are. And that is why people chase astrology, personality types, political tribes, because they offer answers. They say, this is what you are, this is how you love, this is why you suffer. And in a world of ambiguity, those answers feel like home. But they are not homes, they are scaffolding, temporary structures to help build the real thing. And the real thing is messier, more alive. It contradicts itself, it changes, it surprises. The philosopher Heraclitus wrote, "No man ever steps in the same river twice, for it is not the same river, and he is not the same man." The same is true of identity. It flows, and the tragedy is that most people are not allowed to change. Society remembers. It holds people to past versions. It mocks reinvention. It punishes deviation. And so people shrink. They stick to the script. They become what others expect. Not because they must, but because it feels safer than the risk of becoming. But the price of that safety is high. It is the slow erosion of potential, the quiet death of the unlived life. And so the question must be asked, not who am I, but who am I becoming? Not what is my label, but what am I choosing right now? Because identity is not found. It is created, not in declarations, but in decisions, not in traits, but in actions. And those actions, repeated, become character. So perhaps the goal is not to define the self, but to free it, to let it unfold, to meet it again and again with new eyes, to step into the unknown with curiosity, not fear, and to allow others to do the same. Because the most radical thing anyone can do in a world addicted to certainty is to say, I don't fully know who I am, but I'm willing to find out. There is a certain kind of exhaustion that creeps into the bones of modern life, not from labour or hunger or war, but from constant attention, from the endless spinning of the mind, from the soft tyranny of choice, and it whispers, something is wrong, but I don't know what. People wake up tired, scroll through fragments of other people's lives, pretend to laugh, pretend to care, chase productivity like a ghost, and still feel empty. This isn't depression. It isn't laziness. It is a symptom of what philosophers call the hyper-real, a term coined by Jean Baudrillard to describe a world where signs and simulations have replaced reality itself, where people don't experience truth directly, but through filtered versions of it, curated, edited, performed. Think of the photo of a sunset more beautiful than the sunset itself. Think of a life lived more online than in the body. Think of a memory recalled more often than it was lived. In the hyper-real, people begin to mistake the representation for the thing. They chase ideals that don't exist. They compare themselves to illusions. And in doing so, they forget how to feel real. This is the erosion of presence, the slow death of the here and now. And it has consequences. Attention becomes fractured. Intimacy becomes performance. Even rest becomes another task. And in this restless state, people become vulnerable, not to physical threats, but to psychological drift. They lose touch with meaning, with depth, with silence. But the irony is that this chaos was born from abundance, from freedom, from progress. Too many choices, too much information, too many voices telling them who to be, what to buy, how to live. The psychologist Barry Schwartz calls this the paradox of choice. The idea that while some choice is necessary for autonomy, too much leads to paralysis, anxiety, and regret. When there are 10,000 options, every decision feels like a test. Every yes carries 1,000 invisible no's, and people begin to fear missing out more than they value what they have. This fear, FOMO, as it's casually named, is not shallow. It is existential. It whispers that somewhere else, someone is doing life better, and that if one doesn't keep moving, scrolling, upgrading, they will be left behind. But behind what? That's never clear, because the goalposts keep shifting. First, it's success, then happiness, then health, then relevance, then something else entirely, and the chase never ends, because the system was never designed to let people arrive. It profits from their hunger, from their insecurity, from their belief that something is missing, and so it manufactures that feeling again and again. This is the dark genius of consumer culture. It doesn't sell products, it sells dissatisfaction. And in doing so, it creates a world where nothing is ever enough, where people mistake stimulation for joy, where silence feels like failure, and stillness feels like death. But stillness is not death. It is the doorway to reality, the only place where truth can be heard. The Taoists knew this. Lao Tzu wrote that to master the world, one must master stillness, that the sage does not act from ambition, but from alignment, that the greatest strength is softness. But in modern life, softness is mocked, stillness is feared. People are told to hustle, to grind, to monetize their passions, to optimize their mornings, as if life were a business plan, as if value comes only from motion. But the soul doesn't move at that pace. It speaks in slow rhythms, in quiet aches, in dreams that don't fit on a schedule. And when it is ignored, it rebels, not with screams, but with numbness, with fatigue, with the quiet sense that something is missing, even when everything seems fine. This is not failure. It is signal, a soft warning that life has drifted from its center. And the way back is not more effort. It is less. It is subtraction. It is asking gently, what would happen if I stopped? If I stepped away from the noise? If I let the silence speak? That silence is not empty. It is full of the things that matter. Connection, wonder, attention. But to access it, one must first be willing to feel discomfort. Because the first thing silence brings is the noise inside. The thoughts, the regrets, the questions that were drowned in distraction. And facing those takes courage. But on the other side is presence. And presence is power. Not the loud kind, the deep kind. The kind that doesn't need validation. That doesn't compare. That simply is. This is what mindfulness really means. Not productivity, not calm, but intimacy with reality. The ability to sit with what is, without needing to change it. To observe the mind without obeying it. To feel the moment fully without reaching for the next. And from that place, choices become clearer. Desires become simpler. Life begins to feel real again. Not perfect, but real. And that is enough. Because when the present is enough, the chase ends. And in that stillness, something ancient returns. A memory of what it felt like to be a child lying in grass. To watch clouds drift. To be alive without effort. That memory is not gone. It is waiting. Beneath the noise, beneath the shoulds, beneath the stories. And the path back is always the same. Breathe, pause, listen. There is a soft lie that lives at the center of most decisions, most regrets, most forms of anxiety. It is the belief that control is possible, that life can be managed like a spreadsheet or a machine, that if one thinks hard enough, plans well enough, works fast enough, they can avoid pain, avoid loss, avoid the unknown. But this belief, though comforting, is the source of quiet madness. Because life is not a problem to be solved, it is a current to be moved through. And the more one resists it, the more it resists back. This is the hidden cause of so much suffering. Not the chaos itself, but the refusal to let it move. The white-knuckled grip on expectations, outcomes, people, even the self. But nothing in nature clings this way. Rivers do not try to hold their shape. Trees do not resent the wind, even the body. at its healthiest, knows how to release. The breath comes in, the breath goes out. Tension rises and falls. Everything cycles, everything yields, everything dies and is reborn. Yet the mind fears this. The mind wants straight lines, predictable plots, guarantees, but real life laughs at those things. Real life arrives uninvited, rewrites the story, pulls the floor out from beneath the feet, and the tragedy is not that people fall, it's that they thought they were supposed to fly in a straight line, and when they couldn't, they blamed themselves. Not the myth, but it is the myth that is broken, not them. This myth of control is deeply embedded, taught from childhood, reinforced by systems, sold by corporations. Plan your future, schedule your success, visualize your dreams, as if the universe is a vending machine, and discipline the coin. But the Stoics knew better. Epictetus taught that the only thing under one's control is perception. Everything else, health, wealth, reputation, even life itself, is external. And to invest one's peace in the external is to be a slave to chance, to fortune, to other people's actions. And yet most people do exactly this. They place their peace in fragile hands. They say, I'll be okay if this person loves me, if this job works out, if my body looks this way, if they like my post, but each of those things is a wave. And when the wave breaks, they break too. Not because they're weak, but because they tied their anchor to a storm. This is why the ancients spoke of surrender. Not as defeat, but as wisdom, Lao Tzu said. Those who flow as life flows know they need no other force, and surrender in this sense does not mean giving up. It means giving in. It means moving with rather than against. It means trusting that the unknown contains not just danger, but also transformation. Because control is static, and life is dynamic, and trying to freeze it is like trying to hold smoke. The tighter the grip, the less remains, and the cost of this illusion is enormous. It creates anxiety, perfectionism, obsession. It makes people afraid to love, afraid to try, afraid to rest. It turns sleep into performance, rest into guilt, creativity into pressure. It says do more, fix more, improve, 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 until nothing feels enough. And then it sells relief in the form of products, pills, apps, distractions. But none of them work because the problem is not out there. It is in the belief that life must be managed, not lived. And when people start to see this, a strange peace emerges. Not a loud triumph, but a quiet shift, a softening. And in that softening, the world begins to look different. Moments become fuller. Relationships become less about control and more about connection. Ambition becomes less about status and more about expression. Pain becomes less terrifying and more like weather, something to be moved through, not solved. And even fear loses some of its grip, because fear feeds on illusion. And when the illusion breaks, so does the fear. This is the paradox. To feel safe, one must first accept that safety is not guaranteed. To feel free, one must first let go of the need to control. This is not surrender in the spiritual sense alone. It is biological, neurological, practical. Studies show that people with high uncertainty tolerance have lower anxiety, better decision-making, more resilience, not because they know more, but because they resist less. And resistance is what creates friction. Not the event itself, but the story around it. The belief that it should be different, that it must be fixed immediately, that it's a sign of failure. But what if it's not? What if the detour is the path? What if the breakdown is the beginning? What if the unknown is not the enemy, but the only place where real growth happens? Because certainty, though comfortable, is a closed loop. Nothing new can enter, but uncertainty is open, alive. It is where creativity lives, where insight comes, where the self becomes more than habit. And so the invitation is not to fight the current, but to listen to it, to ask, what is this moment asking of me? Not what did I plan, not what did I expect, but what is real, right now, and how can I move with it, even if I don't know where it leads? Because maybe that's the point. Maybe life isn't about arriving, but about attending. Not about winning, but about witnessing. Not about control, but about contact. Contact with truth, contact with feeling, contact with each other, even if it hurts, even if it ends. Because the end is part of it too, and control can never prevent that. Only numb it, delay it, distort it, but not stop it. And in that sense, surrender is not loss, it is clarity. It is the deep recognition that the river is not something to cross, it is something to enter. And in entering, one becomes not the master of life, but part of it finally, truly part of it. There is a strange quiet fear that lives inside most people, a fear not of monsters or violence or death itself, but of being deeply seen and still not being loved, of being known entirely and found unworthy. So instead of revealing, they perform. Instead of opening, they manage impressions, build personas, polish masks, and over time, the mask becomes sticky. It adheres, it blurs with the face beneath, until even they can't tell what's real anymore. And this performance, constant, subtle, exhausting, becomes the shape of their lives. They laugh when they're sad, stay silent when they want to scream, say yes when they mean no, not out of deceit, but out of survival, because somewhere along the way, they learned that authenticity was risky, that vulnerability could cost them love, status, belonging, and so they traded truth for safety, expression, for approval, and in doing so, they entered the realm of what Carl Jung called the persona, the social mask adopted for the sake of function. And while the persona is necessary to some degree, the danger arises when one forgets that it is a mask, when the performance becomes permanent, when the self becomes the role. This is when authenticity dies, not with a bang, but with a quiet sigh, with the daily erosion of inner life. And the result is a person who is liked but not known, admired but not touched, praised but not understood. And they feel it, the emptiness, the loneliness, but can't explain it, because from the outside everything seems fine. This is the tragedy of performance. It gets applause, even as it drains the soul, and the longer it continues, the harder it becomes to stop. Because to remove the mask is to risk rejection, and rejection, for the nervous system, is no small thing. Evolutionarily speaking, to be cast out was to die, and so even now in modern society, the body responds to social disapproval with real panic, real threat signals, and that's why people fear being fully seen. Not because they're cowards, but because their biology remembers exile. And yet, paradoxically, the only path to real connection is through that risk, through the exposure, through the trembling, because intimacy is not built on perfection, but on shared truth, and truth is always a little bit raw, a little bit messy. This is what Brené Brown's research shows so clearly, that vulnerability is not weakness, but the birthplace of love, of courage, of creativity, and yet people avoid it because it feels like falling, like losing control, like standing on a stage naked while the world holds up scorecards. But most of those scorecards are in their own minds, because the harshest critic is often internal, the voice they inherited from a parent, a teacher, a bully, the voice that says, you are only valuable when you're useful, only lovable when you perform, and that voice becomes the lens, the inner judge, the standard, and until it is questioned, it rules silently. And this is where healing begins, not with affirmations, not with external validation, but with recognizing that voice, noticing its patterns and asking, whose voice is this? Is it mine? Is it true? And slowly, softly, reclaiming the self that exists underneath. The self that was never wrong, just hidden, just waiting. This is the work of becoming real. And it is not easy because the world rewards performance. It likes polished answers, curated identities, clear narratives. But people are not narratives. They are novels in revision. They are poems still being written. And the best ones are confusing, contradictory, beautiful in their chaos. And so to be authentic is not to be consistent. It is to be honest. And honesty often looks like change, like uncertainty, like saying I was wrong, like saying I don't know. And that's terrifying in a culture that demands certainty, clarity, branding, but the alternative is spiritual suffocation, the slow death of the unsaid, and the body feels it, the tension, the ache, the disconnection, because the body always knows when it's being silenced. It tightens, it fatigues, it acts out. And sometimes the cure is not medication, but expression, not escape, but return. Return to the self, the real one, the one beneath the performance, the one who doesn't need to impress just to be. And this return is not a one-time event. It is a practice, a habit of checking in, of asking, am I performing right now, or am I present? Am I seeking approval, or am I telling the truth? And telling the truth, even gently, is a revolution, because it interrupts the game, it breaks the spell, and sometimes that honesty will cost something, a relationship, a job, a reputation. But what it gives back is breath, is aliveness, is a life that actually fits. And that is worth more than applause, because applause fades, but alignment endures, and the path to alignment is narrow. It's not loud or glamorous, it's quiet. It's a series of small choices, of saying no when pressured, of saying yes when scared, of staying when it's hard, of leaving when it's dead, and each choice is a stitch, sewing the self back together, and over time, the mask begins to loosen. Not with force, but with truth. And one day, it falls off entirely. Not with drama, but with ease, and what remains is not perfect, not impressive, but real. And real is rare, and rare is sacred. There is a haunting, almost holy silence that follows the realization that nobody is coming to save you. Not really. Not in the way childhood imagined. Not in the way the movies promised. And at first this feels like abandonment, like betrayal, like some great lie has finally shown its teeth. But then, slowly, it becomes something else entirely. Not despair, but liberation. Because if no one is coming, then nothing is stopping you. If there is no rescuer, there is also no warden. And what once felt like loneliness begins to resemble freedom. And this truth, while cold at first, begins to warm the bones when held with honesty. Because it points to a deeper power, a quieter kind of strength. The kind that doesn't need permission, that doesn't ask the world to change before taking a step. It just begins, even in fear, especially in fear. And this is where responsibility becomes sacred. Not as a burden, but as a doorway, because responsibility is the price of freedom. And freedom, though often romanticized, is messy, unglamorous, sometimes brutal. It means no one else is to blame. No one else is at fault. And this is terrifying until it becomes empowering. Until it reveals the absurd but liberating truth that meaning is not found, it is made, that purpose is not delivered. It is chosen. And this flies in the face of everything passive in the soul, every part waiting to be discovered, crowned, chosen by fate or fortune. But fate is not an author. It is a mirror. It reflects the story being written, and the pen is in the hand, always has been, even when it felt otherwise. This is what existential philosophers like Sartre and Camus whispered from the edge of the absurd, that life has no inherent meaning, but the absence of meaning is not the end, it is the beginning. Because in that absence is the invitation to create, to build, to decide. And this is not nihilism. Not the cold shrug of nothing matters, but the fierce clarity that anything can matter. That meaning is an act of rebellion against the void. And to live as if life has meaning is to give it meaning. To walk the path is to create the path. And this act, this defiance, this choice, is the flame that lights the dark. But choice is heavy. It is not easy to carry. It means owning the outcomes, the missteps, the harm caused unintentionally. And that's why most people avoid it. Not because they're weak, but because they were taught to seek instruction, taught to obey, taught to wait for answers. And in doing so, they were robbed of their own authority. But authority is not something given. It is something claimed. Not through domination, but through alignment. The quiet alignment of action with value, of intention with behavior. And the moment someone begins to live this way, the world shifts, subtly but undeniably. because now their center of gravity is internal. And people who move from that center are rare, powerful, quietly magnetic, not because they're loud, but because they are whole. And wholeness is irresistible in a fractured world. But wholeness requires integration, and integration requires courage. The courage to look at every part of the self. Not just the flattering ones, not just the strengths, but the weaknesses, the shame, the wounds, and not to judge them, but to include them, because what is not integrated controls from the shadows. What is denied returns as fate, as Jung warned, and so the real work is not to become better, but to become more complete, to bring light to what has been hidden, to bring compassion to what has been condemned, and in doing so, to become free. Not perfect, but free from the need to pretend, free from the need to perform, free to choose what matters, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. Because the hardest choices are the ones that shape identity. And identity is not a fixed trait. It is a pattern, a rhythm, a story in motion, and every choice is a sentence in that story. And so the question becomes, what story am I telling with my life? Not the story I say, but the one I live. The one revealed in habits, in priorities, in silence, because silence speaks louder than words. And the way a person spends their time tells more truth than their declarations ever could. And in the end, this is what it comes down to. Not what was inherited, not what was done to them, but what they chose to do with it. Because pain is not unique, betrayal is not rare, loss is not special, but what someone builds from those things. That is the real signature of a life. That is the art. And everyone is an artist whether they know it or not, shaping each moment like clay, sculpting with decisions, carving with attention, and the masterpiece is not what they leave behind, but what they become. And becoming is always possible. No matter the past, no matter the pain, because the self is not a statue, it is a river, and rivers can change course, can carve new paths, can break through stone if given enough time, and the only thing that stops them is the dam of belief, the story that says, this is who I am, this is all I'll ever be. But stories can be rewritten, beliefs can be unlearned, and identity can be reborn, not once, but again and again, because that is what it means to be alive, not to be fixed, but to be free.